Hello and welcome to this week's IG Live. We are going to be talking to author M.T. Khan, and we're going to be talking to her about her series, Speculative Fiction for middle grade readers. It's really wonderful. I've had a chance to read the first book, and I can't wait to read the second one, which came out recently, and that's Amir and the Jinn Princess. I have here the first book in the series, which is Nura and the Immortal Palace. Really, really good. So we're going to be talking to her about those. Again, we always are here every Thursday, usually at the same time, 2 o'clock Eastern, but watch for those announcements just in case we have to do something slightly different. And we appreciate your support. As you may know, we are a nonprofit, so your donations help us continue to do this kind of work and get to interview these amazing, diverse authors and illustrators, give you the story behind the stories, which we love to get to do. They are stories with you, so we appreciate your support. Watch out because our flash sale for next year's big event is going to be starting soon, so watch for those announcements. Hello.
Hi everyone.
Nice to see you. And I was just talking about your book. For some reason, the second one hasn't come into my library for me yet, but I got to read Nura and the Immortal Palace, which was amazing, so I can't
Thank you.
wait to read Amir and the Jinn Princess. But first, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself for those that don't know you and tell us what your journey was to becoming an author.
Of course. So hi everyone. I'm Maida, also known as MT Khan. I'm the author of middle grade fantasy novels Nura and the Immortal Palace, as well as Amir and the Jinn Princess. I should have brought that book with me. But I am based in Toronto, Canada. And to give a brief history of how I even became a published author was, I guess, a little bit strange and unorthodox, but when I was in my third year university, that is exactly when COVID hit. And suddenly I had so much more free time than normal because I was studying engineering. And so I was bogged down by work, 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 study, study, study. And so with COVID, the only real advantage of COVID I got was all this sudden free time. And because I was super passionate ever since being a kid about writing and getting my book published, I thought there was no better time than now to write a book and try to sort of navigate the publishing industry and get my book published. And so I think it was like within 2.5, 3 weeks, I wrote Nura in like this like frenzied
Wow.
state. And I was just like, okay, now what? And
For
I
those
guess
that
you could,
don't know, I mean, this is a full novel that you wrote in that short span of time. That's amazing.
yes, because like right after I had like this short time period right before exam season. And I was like, obviously can't write during exam season. How can I, finish this before then? And so just wrote it in a very I honestly cannot do that again. I don't know what what happened once what state I was in, but that's not something I can do again. And afterwards I found out about like Twitter pitch contests, which I think are extinct at this point. I'm not sure, but back in the day there were Twitter pitch contests. And so I ended up pitching Nura during one of the contests, and that's how I scored my agent. And we eventually went on sub with Nura, and that's how I got a book deal with Little Brown.
Well, two reactions. One is I knew you were young. I didn't realize you were that young that you wrote this when you were in college. Um, but also that you were studying engineering. That's so interesting because to me, those seem like such different parts of the brain, especially
Mm,
if you write fantasy. Did that seem like a stretch for you or no? I mean, was it kind of like nice because you were doing something completely different than your engineering?
mm. Yes, actually. I think it's really interesting about people who like use both like the left brain, right brain, and I honestly feel like stories are more like they're similar in like the sense of solving a puzzle that I get from engineering and science. I get that similar like dopamine effect, sort of solving the logic puzzle of how a story works in the sense that, you have these characters, their arcs, but like how do you get from point A to B to C and how does it all come together at the end? It's very much like a puzzle. And so I get that same, euphoric rush when writing a story that I get when like solving an equation or solving a proof. So to me, they seem pretty similar, but like to everybody else, they're like engineering, writing, like how do you like both of these things? And I'm like, just think about it, think about it. They're more similar than you think. But like you said, I also, whenever I got overwhelmed with like deadlines or writing, like just being able to like focus on an engineering project in the background was like a good way to decompress in a way because I'm like if I was like writing for the majority of the day and then my other work was also writing, I think I would go a little bit crazy.
Right. Well, and that's also, now that I'm thinking back on your first book, there actually is a lot of science in it. I mean, you have the craftsman who's basically engineering a lot of different contraptions, and then I'm trying to think like weren't the different parts of the palace, like one was like matter and the other was time.
Mm,
So that makes sense. Like now I can kind of see that, oh yeah, this is written by somebody who loves science, but it wasn't, it was in such an organic way, it wasn't like, oh, she's trying to teach kids science here. It wasn't at all like that, but I can kind of see,
no.
no.
And I was trying to put a little bit more, but my editors were like, let's let's reel this back a bit.
Well, so tell us about Amir and the Jinn Princess, which is the sequel to the first one. What's it about, and what inspired you to write it?
For sure. So, Amir and the Jinn Princess is a companion novel to Nura and the Immortal Palace in the sense that it's the same universe with a different set of characters. And in this book, we follow two different characters. One is Amir, who is a potential heir to a very wealthy Pakistani company. And the second is Shamsa, who is a princess to a magical Jinn kingdom. Um, and so Amir needs Shamsa's help to find his missing mother, while Shamsa needs Amir's help to win the Jinn throne. And so they form this shaky alliance together, but there is a terrible secret lurking underneath that could shatter everything they're working towards.
That's so, I can't wait to read it. But it's also interesting to me because you've said that in some ways that, the first book was a lot of, for those that haven't read it, it talks about child labor. And so you're talking about poverty and inequality, and that's kind of a theme that runs through the book. And now you have now you're kind of looking at the other side, but you've said that, because you're looking at really wealthy, privileged people in the
Mm.
universe and in ours, but you said that's kind of just like a different way to look at inequality. So what made you think to kind of do this kind of flipped perspective on it?
Yeah, definitely. It was very much intentional on my part to have Nora and the Immortal Palace focus on the story from the perspective of the victims, who in that case were these, child minors who were, struggling to make ends meet and working through very hazardous conditions. And so through Nora's story, I was able to tell, you know, an underdog story about what can these underprivileged kids do to even slightly change the situation that is posed to them. However, when you look at the bigger picture or the external forces that are contributing to that problem, you realize there's only so much that these kids can do themselves, right? And so I wanted to juxtapose Noura's underdog story with a story about a boy who comes from privilege and what his place in this, child labor exploitation story comes from. And so I wanted to write from a character who comes from a position of power, from privilege, and talk about the role or the responsibility that people more privileged have to people who lack this privilege. And so it's sort of, in a sense, Amir mirrors Noura's story, and we get to see how much more these people in power can really do to change the world and change the situation around them. And that's what I hope, readers also take away is that, if you do come from a place of privilege, then you have the ability to help people struggling in ways that they can't help themselves.
Right. And I want to come back to that about talking about poverty and inequality in middle grade novel. But first, I want to just to talk about Jinn. Is it Jinn or is I wasn't sure if the plural is Jinn or Jinns, but anyway, talking about the
I
Jinn.
interchange it, honestly.
Okay, good. That's not just me. But we normally think of them as tricksters. That, like in Nora's book, that her mom was always telling her, "You don't trust them. They're going to try and fool you." And yet, you kind of show in both of your books that there's a possibility of humans and Jinn working together. So, what made you decide to do that kind of twist on the traditional portrayal?
Yeah. So Jinn have been around for like thousands of years, like millennia at this point, and they're sort of used as like cautionary tales on like what a human should or shouldn't do. And even as I was growing up, they were kind of used as warnings from my parents of like, oh, you shouldn't do this or don't do that or all these things because a Jinn is going to get you. And so I was kind of raised under like the culture or the guise that, Jinn are always bad. Like it's very black and white. Humans are good and Jinn are bad. However, the more research I did, the more I understood that like Jinn are very similar to humans. They form their own communities, their own families. They're very much like us,
Mm.
but in a sense misunderstood, or in a sense that they are like us, but in a different um, outward appearance and a different dimension. And so I wanted to explore the idea that Jinn are our mirrors. And when in the story these characters face off with these jinns or they form alliance with these jinns, they can sort of see their own shortcomings or their own um, or what they could possibly gain through these actions of these jinn. So sometimes I show bad jinn and then sometimes I show good jinn, and then these humans looking at how these jinns behave realize that there are different paths that they can take, and these jinn act as that mirror into those different paths. So it's like if I did X, Y, and Z and go down this darker path, this is possibly who I could be. Whereas if I am like, Shamsa, where I'm, more positive, more outgoing, this is the path that I could possibly take. So I think Jinn work in like this very interesting literary device way where I can sort of use them as characters, but also mirrors into human psychology and behavior.
It's so interesting in how you do that because especially thinking about young readers, that is like a really easy way for them to kind of conceptualize these very abstract concepts you're talking about.
Right.
A character they can see and kind of relate to. Which, speaking of that, I know you've talked about kind of how you approach talking about difficult issues with younger readers, and that a lot of people see it kind of
Mm.
as a burden or kind of a constraint because you can't talk about it in a really straightforward way like you would with adults, and instead you have to use metaphor, but you actually find that like a really fun challenge, which I guess goes back to your idea of like having a puzzle you can work on. So can you
Yes.
talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think when people hear constraints, they think of constraints as a downside. And I think constraints are exactly where the best innovative ideas can flourish. Because if you have the entire world in your hands, what are you going to do with it? And, there are 1,000 different possibilities, but that doesn't mean those 1,000 different possibilities are equally good. And with these different limitations or constraints, you're it's exactly what you're saying. It's like a puzzle where now you have to find the right loopholes. Now you have to find the right paths and routes to take to get that the most interesting story, but with those constraints not as a limitation, but exactly why the story works. And I don't know if that sounds confusing, but in the sense that if your constraint is, we're not talking about, or we're not going to go into detail about very dark and mature subject matter, that is one constraint. But because of that constraint, we can find a much more interesting way to tell the story, which might, use an allegory such as the Jinn realm. And for me, the Jinn realm is that veil, or is that way to take that constraint and flip it on its head and show, this adventurous, this magical place, and still be able to talk about that difficult subject matter, but in this lens or veil that is adventurous and fun and pulls readers in as opposed to scares them away. And I think with those constraints, you're allowed to, let your imagination really push those boundaries and, find possibly, better ways and alternatives to tell a story versus having no limitations at all.
And I should mention that the reason I even knew that this was something you had thought a lot about is because you wrote an article about that. So if people want to dive into this more, which I think is a really interesting topic, they can go to your Instagram feed and you have a link to the art, or you have excerpts from the article there, which
Yes.
is really interesting. And so is that part of why you chose to do speculative fiction, or what was it that kind of drew you to that genre?
Yes. I think from a young age, I just like loved fantasy in general. I found real life very boring. And as an adult, I think that possibly stands even more now, but I just love the idea that there was, a world separate to ours where there are mermaids, there are dragons, there's all this, fantastical stuff happening. And so I think I was always drawn to the fantasy genre as like a viewer or as a reader. And then when I came to start writing my own fantasy, I think there is this like attraction, or there is this really interesting part about being a fantasy writer where you can create your own worlds, and that world becomes its own entity and it almost works without you there. And I think that is the most interesting thing, where you can, sort of plant a seed of an idea and watch it grow as the story progresses. And seeing that progression is, very satisfying. And I love getting to see that in a fantasy novel. And also, if we think about it more, um, if we think about it more from a writer writing for a reader, I think fantasy also allows that um, veil or boundary, in the sense that we can talk about things that happen in the real world, but disguise it in this fantasy setting. And so people that are afraid or are opposed to, reading about these things that are happening in the real world will, find and learn about these things, but in the setting of a fantasy novel. And I think that is why fantasy is so great, because it breaks those boundaries and it attracts all sorts of people from different audiences or from different stages of life to talk about a thing that is important, but we also get a really interesting and cool story out of it.
And speaking of writing for a reader, I know you've said that you've gotten such great feedback from South Asian and Muslim kids who have read this because of the main characters, and that was kind of one of your goals, is to have protagonists who are South Asian, who are Muslim, and just show them as kind of normal kids living their lives that are very relatable. What does it mean to a kid to pick up a book and see these characters in a fantasy novel like yours?
Um, so I remember like the first time I really read a popular YA novel that had a brown character in it, and that was Six of Crows by Lee Bardugo, as well as An Ember in the Ashes by Sabaa Tahir. And so I remember being so shocked and surprised that there were like brown characters in these novels, and I was just like, wow, like I didn't think it was possible. I didn't think people could do that. And even at that time when I was writing my own novels, they were all, characters that were white. There weren't any characters of color because I didn't think doing so was possible or would get my book published. And so to see characters who, spoke the same language or who looked like me allowed me to believe that, I could be the main character of my own story and that I can break these boundaries that I thought were unbreakable. And I've gotten so many sweet DMs from both like children and moms and dads who come to me saying, my son or my daughter, they dressed up as Nura for, character day at school, or, my child has read Nura and Amir like 3 times by now. When is your next book coming? And, a lot of these brown parents too, they come to me and they're like, my child can't stop reading these books because they're the only ones that, really reflect our culture and our background. And so they don't want to leave this world yet. So when are you writing another book? But like messages like these always, make my day and keep me going as a writer because I'm I wrote Nura and Amir for that child version of myself and to see that other children are reading it and getting the experience that I always hoped I could have experienced, which is, seeing myself in these books, seeing my culture and my background reflected in these books is, you know, like nothing can really describe that feeling. And I'm so grateful that people are, being like having that resonance with these books.
Yeah, because I mean, you have such a wonderful way of incorporating the culture, um, from everything from like sayings or traditions, also the food. I felt like Nura and the Immortal Palace was one big ad for how do you say gulab jamun. I was like, I need
Gulab jamun, yeah.
it was like the whole time because she just talks about how delicious they are. And I was like, oh, I need to be like reading this with a cup of chai and
Yes.
that was so good. But all right, so when is your next book coming? Are you working on one now?
That I can't say much. I really unfortunately can't say much, but I would hope to return to this world one day
Mm.
for sure.
And do you think that you would stay in middle grade? I mean, that seems to be such a great age group for you. Have you thought about doing something else, or you want to like stay?
I would like to write for everybody. I think I have ideas still in middle grade and YA and adult. So
Nice.
hopefully if I can keep this career going, I would love to write for all ages.
Well, we hope to. I hope that you do because, like I said, I've had a chance to read the first one. It's really amazing, and you've gotten such a great response from your readers. I know. So, thank you for taking the time to talk with us. And when you do have your next project out, we will be sure to share that with our audience as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on today.
It was so fun to talk with you. And for anybody who joined us late, as always, this is going to be up in a few minutes on Instagram, and then later we will have it up on our YouTube channel. So thanks everybody for joining us today, and thank you, Maida, for talking with us.
Thank you so much.
All right,
Have a
bye.
good day.